apparently I've been asked to say 2 words right now to give some sort of evocation of the fact that the performance arts have been alive and well at Columbia and Barnard for a long time, and that they've had something to do with South Asia also for a long time. So I hereby, with my right hand and not my left, testify to the fact that this is so. Let's think. The University's Seminar on South Asia has just passed its 50th anniversary. The South Asia Institute is even older than that. Rachel McDermott is the principal editor for the 3rd edition of the Sources of Indian Tradition, which is a massive thing. We're surrounded by a little bit of history here, and it's a great thing to be. But new things are happening all the time, and Shayani Mitra herself is a kind of example of how new things can happen even in old turf. And you all being here today are the testimony to that fact. We need to say something about our funders, who are the Weiss Fund for making it possible for international visitors to come to Barnard, and then the Barbara Stoller Miller Fund. Barbara Stoller Miller was on the Barnard faculty and was actually Barnard undergraduate as a Sanskritist for many years. And she, in my imagination, stands for something that is also happening today, in that she was a person of many fields. She's known for her translations of Sanskrit works, Bilhana and Bhartrahari, and Kalidasa, and the Gita, and the Yoga Sutras, and the Gita Govinda. That's what we know her for best, and we're able still to use those. But she was also an art historian. She treasured the performative arts. She was interested in theater as such. And I happen to have in my own collection a manila file of hers, which is called very simply Song, in her very beautiful handwriting, which is just a collection of things that she put together over the years to reflect her reading in that field. It's a precious thing that I just happen to have with me. I mentioned Barbara today because I think her example of doing all that in one person still serves as a kind of inspiration for what can be done in Columbia and Barnard in the field of Indian arts. And I must tell you, this is the day of her death, as a matter of fact. It's 21 years now. When you see that magnolia tree come into flower and then begin to lose its petals, you know that the Barbara Miller season has come. So I would just remember Barbara on this occasion. Thanks to the Weiss Foundation, thanks to the Barbara Stoller Miller Fund, which was created by her friends and students in her memory, and Shayani, thanks especially for you, for having put this together for today. And some of you, yeah. I would occasionally pass Shayani in the halls and say, well, how are the plans coming? And she would make some non-committal remark. So I knew not to ask further. But there have been sounds from the 3rd floor of Millbank that have encouraged me to know this week that something is happening in any case. And I guess we'll have some sense of that later today. So thank you indeed. We have a panel of experts today. I was talking about how Barbara Miller did many things. One of the great things is that each of the panelists today also does many things, despite the fact that they have now institutional locations at Columbia that would seem to separate them. We've got Shiv Subramaniam in Misas, that's to say Sanskrit. We have Nandini Banerjee in music. We have Yogi Trivedi in religion, and we have Amanda Culp in theater. But I'll let Amanda tell you how it is that all these things belong together.
Thank you very much, Professor Hawley, for that introduction. So this panel came about as we were beginning to talk about putting this conference together. Shayani and I were discussing how there's a great community of doctoral students here who are interested in Indian performance, but we're so separated by these departmental divides that we don't often get a chance to come together in a professional setting. We come together socially as much as we can, but in a professional setting to really begin to discuss the parts of our work that really do come together quite nicely. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity, knowing that we had not only Nandini, who's in the ethnomusicology department, but we have Shiv and Yogi, whose maybe doctoral work doesn't always combined with their musical talents, but who are both classically trained in with Shiv Carnatic music and with Yogi Hindustani music. And so the question really came, Nandini works with, as she will tell you, works, oh my God, I'm blinking. No, Rabindranath Tagore, I'm so sorry. Nandini works with Rabindranath Tagore. And so when we have Tagore and we have Hindustani and we have Carnatic music together, that doesn't always open the door to conversations about folk and vernacular, but as we began to sit down and talk about this panel, we found that there was really quite a lot to bring into conversation with music's major and minor. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Shiv, who's going to lead us off.
Hello, can everyone hear me? So today I wanted to address this problem of the popular versus the classical as it manifests in the case of Carnatic music. And I just wanted to tell you that I'm talking from the perspective of a Carnatic music performer. I don't know much about the history of Carnatic music, but basically in putting together a concert list when I'm performing, certain questions will come up. How do I kind of stay true to classical, the classical Carnatic pure aesthetic, while at the same time making the performance what's called janaranjakam, or pleasing to a wider audience. So this is what I'll be talking about today, and so I'll begin with a kind of a review of what the typical Carnatic concert format is for anyone who sings Carnatic music today. And then I'll talk about two elements of that format, namely ragam and language choice, in which this popular versus classical question is particularly prominent. So first, the format of a concert. Now, the way that we perform and the way that we listen to Carnatic music in performance today, that format was established by a very important singer in the early 20th century, called Ariyakudi Ramanuja Iyengar. And basically, it was a format that gave prominence to two kinds of music, what's known as Kalpita Sangeetam, or pre-composed music, and Kalpana, or Manodharma Sangeetam, which is improvised music, imaginative music. And I mean, especially in Carnatic music, the first, composed music is also given prominence, I think more so than in Hindustani music, in the sense that all of the great composers, Tyagaraja, Dikshitar, Shyama Shastri, and the others, they composed works that are self-sufficient. You often don't need to sing more, develop the ragam more, other than just the composition itself. So Ariyakudi Ramanuja Iyengar basically brought a format together in which both of these, the composed and the improvisational music, can be given relatively equal emphasis. So basically what it was is you start out with a varnam, which is a kind of warm-up piece, and then the concert will have a few kind of center pieces, what's known as a sub-main, a main, and then this kind of main improvisational format called a ragam planam pallavi, interspersed with just kind of standalone compositional pieces, and then you conclude with a section that comes from the Hindi word tukada, but we call it tukada in the south. But it's just kind of that's the part that you include kind of more crowd-pleasing compositions. So that is basically what the format is like. And for the artist, based on how they present themselves, or whether they identify or they present themselves as a more purist or as a crowd-pleasing or a more popular musician, they will kind of modify this basic format to express their vision of what Carnatic music really is. So basically, I'm now going to talk about how that vision will be expressed in their choice of what ragams they sing, and also in language, how they treat the question of language, of the compositions, and also where they're performing. So first, ragam. So before I talk about this question of the popular versus the classical, I wanted to kind of give a different sort of characterization of what a ragam is. So we often hear a ragam characterized as something like a scale, and then everyone always kind of insists that this is not satisfactory, it's something more than that. I think that maybe we can make up for that what is more part if we think about a ragam as a kind of musical language, that is as a medium as opposed to an object. So I'm just going to push this metaphor of language a little further. So, all of us know that I'm speaking English right now, but we're not registering that fact. If someone were to ask you what language am I speaking, you would say English, but it's fallen into the background. Now, suppose there was a language here that none of us knew. I'm sure someone speaks German in the audience, but I'm just going to use that as an example. Maybe we would be familiar with the sounds of German, and we would be able to recognize it kind of that this is German. But beyond that, we couldn't get into what was being communicated. We wouldn't be able to read German poetry or anything like this. Just kind of keeping this metaphor in mind, this is exactly how a ragam works. You already know the grammar of a ragam. Once you begin singing a ragam, if you ask someone who is very well versed in Carnatic music, what ragam is this, they'd be able to tell you, oh, this is Bhairavi, or this is Dhanyasi, or whatever it is. But once you're in the ragam, it becomes a medium. You are not thinking that this is Bhairavi. This is, and you're always kind of aware of, and you're not aware of whether it's Bhairavi when it's right. You're aware when something ungrammatical happens, when there's an aberration. And then if I just suddenly started speaking English poorly, that would be something to worry about. So that's similar kind of structure. So the reason why I wanted to characterize the ragam in this way is because we can use this to kind of distinguish between popular ragams and very deep traditional ragams. And if I say that the more traditional or pure ragams are ragams that have a very deep grammar, ones that you would have had to already been familiar with in order to kind of understand its emotional language. Just to recall the metaphor, so that you have to kind of learn German in order to understand German poetry. In the same way, you have to know Bhairavi very well in order to understand a Bhairavi alapani. So if you're a purist, a Carnatic purist, your concert will be it will more heavily emphasize those kind of ragams. There are a lot of purists who don't like what are known as the popular ragams, which don't have such a grammar. So just to kind of give a sample of this, I just wanted to kind of give you an example. So if I started an alapane by singing immediately someone who knows Carnatic music would know that this is Dhanyasi. I have not sung anything else, but in that, the rest of the ragam is implied. You don't need me to continue the ragam, but as soon as I sing it, your entire mind is flooded with Dhanyasi, and then it becomes a medium of emotional expression. If I'm singing a different kind of ragam, one that doesn't require such a deep knowledge of grammar, a ragam that's more janaranjakam, the notes themselves are so. This is behag. It's a very kind of it's a pleasing ragam because you don't need to know much about it. So in order to so basically, a lot of people, for example, T.M. Krishna, he's like very famous for being a very traditional purist. And so you would never find him singing a behag as a sub-main or a main or a ragam tanam pallavi. He's like, no, that is not pure Carnatic music. You're importing some other aesthetic. You're not getting at what a real ragam is. So this is just to give you a taste of what the ragam question is like, whereas like a popular musician would choose these kind of ragams and then they'll draw in more audiences because of it. Now, do I have 5 minutes? Okay, good. So now on to the question of language. Now there's a big irony in the way Carnatic music is performed today, and that is this. So there are thriving Carnatic music communities in all of the states, all of the South Indian states, but it's the largest community, the kind of largest festival for it is in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, and so and it's also Tamilians are the ones who also kind of have presented Carnatic music on the international stage as well. So the people who are running the Carnatic music, the Cleveland Aradhana, most of them are Tamilians, as well as the way that there's like a community in Australia. So all of this is being done by Tamilians. And the irony is that the majority of Carnatic songs are in Telugu. So no one has any idea what they're singing. I mean, like Tyagaraja he's a brilliant composer. He's the main composer of Carnatic music, and I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that if you go to a Carnatic concert, 60%, more like 80% of the compositions will likely be composed by Tyagaraja. And I mean, I have talked with like Professor Narayana Rao, who studies Telugu literature, who tells me that they're absolutely beautiful as literary pieces by themselves. And if you read translations of Tyagaraja's compositions, I mean, those also, they're quite stunning by themselves without the musical element at all. But what's happened now, because most of these people who are singing it don't have any idea about, or they don't really care about the sahitya or the words of it, it's become kind of, those have become kind of the stepping stones into the improvisational form. You don't, okay, so I'm going to sing, if I sing the name of Rama, every once in a while I know that it's vaguely about the god Rama, but that's not important. What's important is that I'm singing Bhairavi, and the Bhairavi is beautiful. And I mean, Bhairavi is great, so I mean, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. But again, what happens when you put the emphasis so squarely on the music is that you are, people who are coming to it are the kind of purest people who are able to appreciate those deep ragams and things like that. So on the popular side of this, those people who are looking to appeal to a wider audience, they put more emphasis on, so for example, if a popular artist is performing in Bangalore, they'll include compositions of Purandaradasa. And there's always that section at the end, the Tukada section. And so for people who want to appeal to a wider audience, they'll make sure to bring in folk music, like Kavadi Chindus, which is a kind of Tamil folk song, and you sing it in a folk style. Or even Marathi abhangas have become very popular. Like Brajbhasha, Bhakti Pads, all of this stuff is brought in by those popular kind of musicians. And again, the classical musicians kind of look a little bit down upon, oh, you have sung too many tukadas. You should just sing like one or two Tamil, like kind of hardcore tirupugals, and then like end the concert, but mainly focus on like the improvisation. So, I just wanted to give you a taste of how this popular versus classical is negotiated in Carnatic music. And I've presented it rather schematically, so that's only for the sake of clarity. There are musicians like Sanjay Subramaniam who are able to achieve both, but we can't all be Sanjay Subramaniam. But the larger point is that this Carnatic music concert has been constructed as kind of a variety program that is become in some way a sort of balancing act to like sail the boat between these two shores. So I think I'll end there and pass it on to Nandini.
Thank you, Shiv. That was really lovely. I'm going to be presenting on one particular tradition that is prominent in the Bengal region of South Asia, the Baul tradition. and how it has influenced other genres of music. As briefly stated in my abstract, the bawals are wandering minstrels of Bengal. The word bawal itself comes from the Sanskrit word vatula, which roughly means mad or afflicted with the wind disease. They can usually be identified by their distinctive saffron-colored attire. The bawal's central belief is that God can only be reached through the human form. A person's physical body is where God resides, and so to worship the masses is to worship the divine. If we were to characterize the doctrinal thought of the bawals, we might think of it as essentially monistic. Here, man is the microcosm, containing the divine and all the elements of truth within himself. This realization that man contains the divine within himself is to the bawals a unity and is free of the binaries that bind our existence, such as emotion, non-emotion, desire, or abandonment of desire. The bawals have upheld music as their religion, and the language of their songs is the language of the village. Because it originated as purely an oral tradition, the songs have inevitably changed in their passage from mouth to mouth over the centuries. It was only after the death of arguably the most legendary bawal composer, Lalan Fakir, who passed away in 1890, that people began compiling bawal tunes. The imagery that bawals use in their songs are simple, direct, earthly, and powerful. Images of fields, of the river, and the storm and wind, of the village market, of birds, trees, and flowers. Because Bengal, both east and west, now Bangladesh and West Bengal in India, is formed by the vast delta of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers. Rivers and boats figure as prominent tropes among bawal metaphors. The musical content and the bawal's beliefs belong to an unorthodox devotional tradition, which has been influenced by Hinduism, Buddhism, Sufi Islam, and Vaishnavism. Bawals are strictly casteless. This is just a brief quote. Some typical instruments that bawals incorporate in their music repertoires are the ektara, which is a gourd-based one-stringed instrument that is held together with bamboo, the dotara, a 2 to 5 stringed instrument that briefly it resembles a mandolin, a dupki, which resembles a tambourine but with less bells, a kamak, which resembles an ektara, but rather than being held together by bamboo, the player holds the strings, loosening and tightening to alter the pitch, and gungur, or bells. Bawal music repertoires can also incorporate more classical Indian instruments such as the harmonium or tabla. I have 2 brief examples of bawals singing. The first one is on a train ride from Kolkata to a more rural village in West Bengal. And the second is in the rural village itself. the texture of these songs in your ear as we keep going with the presentation. As we can gather, the core message of these songs is about relinquishing material gains. The songs rest heavily upon the longing to find their fellow madman, upon the despair and pain of separation. The crazy one that they speak of is one who can renounce material wealth. Now that we have a brief idea of who the Bawals are, how they live, and what their central doctrines are, I will delve into the background of prominent Bengali philosopher and poet Rabindranath Tagore. Although Tagore's life and works were influenced by, and in turn influenced Western poets, his roots were far more deeply buried in medieval Bengal. Throughout his life, he expressed an unwavering attachment to Bengal. As Paulami Saha insightfully articulates in her 2013 article, Tagore models in his speeches and writings a locally rooted globalism, committed to a universal humanism and an avowed love for his country, and it takes a form that is explicitly neither nationalist nor cosmopolitan. In fact, one might say that Tagore's lyric and prose writings on Bengal argued for a counter-nationalist national attachment. It is precisely his love for Bengal and his country that caused him to stand firmly against the politicization of that love and what he saw as its artificial idolization. Tagore started the Vishwabharati University in the small rural town of Shantiniketan, which means the abode of peace, and that's where the train was headed to when in the first video clip. Shantiniketan is in the Birbhum district of West Bengal. It is around there that every year in the Hindu month of Posh, approximately December 22nd to January 20th, 22nd, there is an enormous festival called the Kenduli Mela, which is a celebratory 3-day fair for the Bawals of Birbhum and of Bengal. One of the arguably most virtuosic Bawal singers who is alive today, Purnadas Bawal, was born in 1933 in a village in the pastoral Birbhum and has traveled the world to promote his ancestral music. I'm presenting here a rare clip of Purnadas Bawal singing a Rabindra Sangeet, a song that was written by Tagore and that was influenced musically and contextually by Bawal songs. In a certain doctrinal and literary sense, Tagore was profoundly influenced by the Bawals' mysticism and by their quest of spiritual emancipation and embodiment of an inner God. However, according to some scholars, such as Edward Dimmock, who is an extremely well-versed scholar in Tagore and Bawal music, in a social and perhaps intellectual sense, Tagore might have been a ways away from being a Bawal. He came from an aristocratic family, and thus his image of the Bawals was an idealized one. Quote, "Perhaps the wild freedom of the Bawals represented something which he would have liked to have had." I believe Tagore's myriad Bawal-influenced songs proved how intimately he learned about and internalized the Bawals' life doctrines. For Tagore, Bawal literature had a deeper and personal resonance, one that fell in stride with his doctrines of anti-colonialism and communal harmony. The genre of his songs, as well as of his writing, is seen as part of classical literature, of an art culture for the elite. However, for Tagore, the challenge was to transcend the educated, urban middle class and bring unity between the rural and urban Bengali. His main mission at his university in Shantiniketan was to create a zone of bonding that would sensitize the elite class to the plight of the rural milieu. Idyllic verses of the holistic pastoral Bengal are common in many of his songs. As we listen to this last song, a Baul influenced Rabindra Sangeet sung by Hemanta Mukherjee, I hope we have gathered an idea of the elasticity and potential of musical genres to permeate borders and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. So the problem of differentiating or categorizing music in South Asia, or in Sanskrit as it's referred to as the Vargikaran of music, has been done primarily in two categories, Deshi and Margi, done pretty early on. Margi being what we today refer to as classical, and Deshi as the other. The vernacular, the folk, the light, the semi-classical, the light classical, different ways to refer to it. And yet there is this one sub-tradition wherein this vargikaran, this categorization, this classification, the line on that spectrum of where Margi and Deshi fall is blurred, and that is Bhakti Sangeet, devotional music. So today in my presentation, I would like to specifically focus on one example, or an example or two from within one tradition, of how this process of blurring and redefining or reconstructing the classical has been done. I start primarily by giving an introduction to the Swaminarayan Sampradaya. My examples are from there. And one poet, a founder poet named Premanand, in the late 18th, early 19th century. I do not argue that the process is only specific to the Swaminarayan Sampradaya, but I do suggest that there are a few reasons why this community from within the Bhakti tradition is a model example for taking a close look at this process of blurring or reconstructing or refining. The Swaminarayan Sampradaya grew out of Gujarat and primarily Saurashtra in the early 19th century. Theologians have argued that the theology is close to the Ramanuj Sampradaya and the Sri Vaishnavas, and its liturgical practice is close to the Vallabhites and the Vallabh Sampradaya. The Sampradaya's founder, Swaminarayan, was believed to be an incarnation of Krishna by many of his devotees, and by others as the Purushottama, of whom Krishna was a mere incarnation. Now, I mention this theology here because it plays a serious role in the shaping of the musical tradition of the Sampradaya in my larger project. Given these similarities, the Swaminarayan Sampradaya has often been compared to the earlier four Vaishnava Sampradayas and has often even been seen as a puritanical or perhaps even a more, if I may, Protestant form of the Vallabh Sampradaya. Today, the Swaminarayan Sampradaya's presence in social, cultural, and the architectural landscape of diaspora and contemporary India is quite noticeable. Now I turn to Premanand, on whose bhakti poetry I will focus today. He was one of Swaminarayan's 8 poets, or Ashtakavis, who wrote poetry in 9 different languages. Now, 3 hagiographies tell us that Premanand was born a Muslim and then became a Vaishnava, and The other 3 tell us that he was born a Brahmin but raised by Muslims and then became a Vaishnava. In either case, his ability to write Bhakti Pads in Farsi, Urdu, and Dakkani certainly suggest Islamic influence in his upbringing. He trained musically in Ujjain in northern India with Jaina musicians and with musicians performing in the courtesan circuit. Now this is emphasized by the amount of horis and tumris he has written, all trademark subgenres of the courtesan culture during that period. We also know that Premanand was interacting with performers at the court of the kings of Bhavnagar and Vadodara, notable strongholds of Drupad and Khayal performance, and he was doing so even after his initiation as an ascetic in the Swaminarayan fold. Now, what sets the Sampraday's performative traditions apart from previous Bhakti Sampradayas is that the performative tradition of the Sampradaya did not bear one single identity, whether it is in terms of language, literary genre, or musical genre. For instance, the Vaishnavas of Braj and Rajasthan and even Gujarat were known for their Drupad like Haveli Sangeet or Samajgan, the Gaudiyas in Bengal for their Kirtans, and the Varkaris in Maharashtra for their Abhangs, the Sant tradition in Gujarat for their Prabhatis or Prabhatyas in Gujarati and Chausars, and if I may include them here, the Sufis for their Qawwalis. The founding poets of the Swaminarayan Sampradaya, however, did not stick to any one genre to ground their compositions in, but rather borrowed from all of the above. Premanand's poetic compositions found in manuscripts from his lifetime contain a confluence of all of these, literary and musical genre influences. And I mentioned that he wrote in 9 different languages, some of you might be curious: Gujarati, Braj, Avdi, Urdu, Dakkani, Farsi, Punjabi, Bhojpuri, Marwari, Sanskrit. I think that's 9. Premanand's training, personal background, and interaction, and his place within a religious community at the cusp of the early modern and the colonial period, make his poetry and music an interesting case study for the line between the classical and the vernacular in the Bhakti tradition. Now, what I'm going to do is fast forward a couple of years, and instead of talking about the performative period, which I just did to lay out the background for today's paper, I would like to here show examples of how that process of recreating and reconstructing of the classical, or that shifting of the line, is understood within the Sampradaya today. And I would like to bring out some of the examples that I myself as a performer have experienced in my travels here in North America, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The first thing that we notice is the changing of the genres. So Premanand's manuscripts, the Bhakti Pads that we have found in manuscripts contemporary of his own time, suggest that, or show that he has written the genre, so whether Drupad, Khayal, Tumri, Hori, Bhajan, he makes it very clear as to which genre he's composing that bhajn, and also the raga, and sometimes even the tal. But now what we see today is that those compositions are being performed almost in opposite genres. So what I mean to say is that Drupad compositions are often sung as non-rhythmic bhajans, or even as garbas or rasas, very Gujarati influence. And then often even that garbas and Gujarati influence, regionalized influence pads, bhakti pads, are sung as parts of Khayal compositions or tumris or horis. I'd like to give an example if I may, and I apologize in advance for any besurapam that you may hear. The first pad that I highlight here is was written as a garba, or a devotional, a very regionalized pad where there's a dholak playing usually, obviously the harmonium, there's the chorus involvement. But what we see here today, and how it's performed in the tradition, is that it's performed as a Khayal influenced or even a Tumri influenced bhakti pad. Padharola let Vedi, oh, Premanand, Anand Atishe, Premanand, Anand Atishe, Sundar Mukhe Heri, oh, let Kadale Heri, Padharola. And the opposite is also true. When we see pads that were specifically written in the Drupad genre are now sung in a Rajasthani folk or a Hori type genre. Sorry. Shouldn't even be using this if it's a folk genre, right? Na Tori mori preetan chute, Tori mori preetan chute, re pyare, Tori mori preetan chute, samji vichari pyare, to sujori pyare, तो सुजोरी काऊ की तोराइन छूटे, जोरी प्रीत जानी साचे सनही, जोरी प्रीत जानी साचे सनही, और सनही सब झूठे रे प्यारे, और सनही सब झूठे रे, तोरी मोरी प्रीतन छूटे, तोरी मोरी प्रीतन, तोरी मोरी प्रीतन, तोरी मोरी प्रीतन छूटे. The first thing we notice is the swap in genres. The other thing we notice is the change in the use of ragas. Once, and I won't sing these because there's a noted classical Carnatic musician here amidst us, and I won't make the mistake of doing so. But obviously Charukeshi, Rag Charukeshi, which was taken from the Carnatic system much later, very recently, I would say maybe 20, 30 years ago, is now being used to sing a pad in specific settings where there are Tamil speaking or a native Tamil Nadu satsangis or devotees as they're called. So I was in Houston maybe just 3.5 years ago, and I was told to sing something in Tamil, and I politely refused, and I said, I can't do that for obvious reasons. They said, then we'll sing something in a raga that the people from Tamil Nadu here can appreciate. And I said, okay, in Charukeshi might do it. And so there was a pad that is sung in Bihag or Behag, as you mentioned. Very simple raga, which was then turned into a very complex composition and sung in Charukeshi. Not only is there a borrowing process from the Carnatic system, but there's a borrowing process that's being used from Bollywood films. So Rag Jog, which was popularized in the 50s and 60s by many Bollywood hit songs, and then was then started to have been used by classical musicians in the Hindustani system, notably Pandit Bhimsen Joshi, Pandit Jasraj, Pandit Rajan Sajan Mishra, is now sung very popularly and very commonly in the Bhakti circuit, in Bhakti by Bhakti musicians. Specifically after Shangar Arti in the morning. It's not even a morning raga, it's a nighttime raga. If I may just very quickly give you one example. तुम बिन कौन सगो हरि मेरो मात पिता युवती सुत बांधव मिल के सब दुख देत गणेरो मिल के सब दुख देत गणेरो तुम बिन कौन सगो हरि मेरो. The other thing I'd like to point, and I know my time is almost up, I have about 30 seconds left, is that even when regionalized Gujarati Ras or Garba type bhajans are sung, there's a classical element that is inserted because that is something that, especially in the diaspora, the audience is wanting, is requiring, almost mandating. One example from that is one of Premanand's Bud sang in a hinch, a particular style of Garba. Hey taruna manohar murti re रेखा उठे नानी नानी जीवन जोया लागे छे रे धर्म कुंवर हरि कृष्ण नी रे मूर्ति मारे मन मानी जीवन जोया लागे छे रे वेढ वीटियो कड़ा साकड़ा शोभे छे करवर माय प्रेमानंद छवि ऊपरे रे प्रेमानंद छवि ऊपरे रे प्रेमानंद प्रेमानंद छवि ऊपरे रे तन मन धन बल जाय जीवन जोया लागे छे रे ए जीवन जोया लागे छे रे. And then the last example that I'd like to give is to go from reciting to singing. I was once in Paris, and the Cheshtapad, which is sung usually after Shayanati at night, is not usually sung, it's just recited. Pode Prabhu Sakala Muni Kesham Swami Narayana Divya Murti Swami Narayana Divya Murti Santan Ke Visharam Hari Om Santan Ke Visharam Pode Prabhu Sakala Muni Kesham. What happened was that I was delivering a katha, and at that time it was time for Shaina, and it happened that that pad needed to be delivered. Now in the middle of that katha pravachan or just even katha vachak performance that I was giving at that time, how would one just stop in the middle and recite that pad? And so what I decided to do was sing it in a raga that was part of my repertoire. It wasn't a night raga, I might highlight again, Bhimpalasi or Patdeep, Aberi in the Carnatic system, which is usually an afternoon raga. And there, because I felt that that was the emotion that I was feeling at that time and that the audience would respond to, I sang it in a raga with disregard, obviously, to the tradition of recitation and to disregard to the close relationship between the raga and the aesthetic rasa. I might just highlight that for a second here. Podhe Prabhu Sakala Muni Kesha Swami Narayana Divya Murti Santan Ke Vishra Podhe Prabhu Sakala Muni Kesha Sharad Shesh Mahesh Mahamuni Japat Jehi Gunna जाशपदरज शीर्षधरिधरी जाशपदरज शीर्षधरिधरी ओवत जननिष्काम पोढ़े प्रभु सकल मुनि के श्याम पोढ़े प्रभु सकल मुनि के श्याम. So finally, is to draw some initial conclusions, and obviously this is part of my larger project. But what has changed from Premanand's time? So Premanand and the founding composers were obviously including different subgenres within their repertoire. But today performers are not just including them in their repertoire, but often mixing and fusing them into the same composition. The lines between the classical and vernacular are still being blurred, but in a different manner. Now there are obvious important questions that still need to be asked. It's to be done to me right now. Is obviously the question of languages and linguistic choice. I mentioned Premanand's obvious varied choice of writing his pads, but how are Premanand's non-Gujarati and non-Hindi pads being remembered or used? More importantly, how are his Urdu and Farsi pads being used or sung? Are they being sung in the Bhakti environment in mandirs? And then more importantly, how is the Kathavachak tradition influencing this? And so theology plays an important role here. And then obviously the influence of the West. And so more and more sadhus and bhajaniks are listening to Mariah Carey and Alicia Keys. And that is obviously the a cappella style and also the sort of pop fusion style is influencing. Just 2 days ago I was at Vaishnav Haveli. There was a young man sitting there with a box guitar and singing a Sharnkar morning bhakti pad in English, a translation of one of Premanand's bhakti pads in English and in sort of maybe a pop cultural rock style. I wouldn't know how to define it. But there's a clear twist here. And so there are important questions that need to be asked, and I still need to ask them. But thank you very much for listening to this project in its full name.
Mayanya, thank you very much to all of our panelists. I would begin the questioning, but I get them all the time, and so in the interest of all of your time, I'd like to open the floor if anybody has some questions for our great panel here. Yes?
This is actually not so much a question, but kind of an extension of what Nandini was saying. You talked about Rabindranath and Baul, but I think by just focusing on one aspect of it, I mean, that's a important asking a question about it, but Rabindranath goes beyond that, because he had adopted a lot of the South Indian Karnataka ragas and also for North Indian ragas. I mean, a couple of things I can think of this as I was listening. Like, and I'm sure I'm a little apprehensive when I talk to a Carnatic specialist right here, because there's Rabindranath's song called Vishwabhinarave. That is based on the Carnatic Raga Shankarvarna. So, and then, there are things like, even the Rangamati chord, the Gamshara, even there's a bow element to it, but there's also very well-known Rajasthan, mainly Rajasthan folk raga called the Mani. And I forget there's a very, very well-known Western folk which I can't remember right now, but it's on that. And so I think, when you confine him just to one aspect, I mean, maybe that's your topic, but I think, you should really need to know that he goes beyond that. Similarly, he does things in North Indian style, like Sahana, which is a very popular and very well-used raga in the so I think that's one thing, I think we need to keep in mind. And to your, and just one thing for the sheep, right? Yeah. Because when you're talking about the populist or the more purist element, but if you really think about the raga Tanan Pallavi, is that's one portion which people who have no idea what Carnatic music is, they can relate to. This is primary instrumental where the violin, the mridangam, and the ghadam, they all play together. So even within that structure, a very strict, well-defined, purist format, there is this element of, I shouldn't say folk, but more populist element that's brought in to make the concert and the performance more attractive and more wide-ranging for the entire audience, because some of them might be Rasikas, but not everybody is. As they similarly do in North Indian classical, like at the very end, Ravi Shankar used to do it all the time, is introduce one of the tunes, which is Bhattiyali or Bahari, which are essentially folk ragas, again, bringing that strict folk populist element into the more classical, more formal structure. So I know it's interesting how they cross and intersect, even when they're essentially talking about simply performing in a much more rigorous classical area. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you for bringing those points up, and I agree. There are very many Indian, Western, South Asian elements that have influenced his music. I personally was focusing on this one aspect just because of the very apparent rural and urban dichotomy that was happening, as well as due to the reasons that I actually had video footage that I took myself of the bowls, so I could incorporate those elements. And I appreciate those points. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I mean, you're right in a sense that there, even in the Ragam Tanam Pallavi, there is a range there. I mean, typically, actually, the Ragam Tanam Pallavi is very classicist. It's when audiences don't know what's going on. It's the chance for them, for the artists to show their mathematical prowess. People are fumbling, putting the talam and everything. But you are right, because actually to water down that kind of hardcore Carnatic-ness of the Ragam Tanam Pallavi, recently it's become very popular to conclude the Ragam Tanam Pallavi with like Ragamalika Swarams. And so you're right, like even within that most classical element of the Carnatic concert, there's a way of making it popular and there's a way of making it more classical.
This is not a question, so I hope comments are okay, but that was a wonderful panel. Thank you very, very much. I mean, as a person trained, I'm trained in what we call on the other side of the border, Indo-Pakistani classical tradition, which is essentially Hindustani music. And one of the things I've always been curious about is what is the relationship between Hindustani and Carnatic. I heard you singing a lot of the ragas, which are very familiar to me in the Hindustani tradition, but being completely ignorant of the southern traditions, it would be really nice to sort of hear that a little more concretely fleshed out, if you wouldn't mind. And the other thing that I was curious about was, talking about the relationship between classical and vernacular. And a project that I've been working on, I'm making a film on Pakistani female singers, and it was fascinating to see that on the Pakistani side of the divide, the classical traditions have pretty much died out. So I'm fascinated to see, obviously in India that has not been the case. We have young people here, like yourselves, doing very rigorous training in it. But on the Pakistan side, it's interesting that the really popular singers are singing which is clearly derived from Hindustani traditions primarily, but don't know it. And so there is a move, and this is what I found in a lot of the questions that I was asking, was that a lot of the young popular singers, some calling themselves Sufi, some just pop, like Nida Kyani, etc. But they're all now sort of referencing the need to go back to classical training because they see that as the ocean from which a lot of the popular music comes from. And I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts about that at all. It still references the classical as the high ground, right? In other words, the vernacular is something that's sort of here, and classical is the true thing, the source to which we must return. And I wondered if you had thoughts about something like that.
Sorry. To pick up on your last point, the idea of the classical being sort of elevated or prioritized, there's a flip side to thinking about it, and that, if I may, is to say that many pop or even bhakti musicians think of themselves as being the gatekeepers, of letting the classical into the popular tradition. That is also a way to frown upon or look down upon, but sort of shifting the scales on who has the sort of final authority on which is the higher or the madi in this context. So I think that is the one way to think about it. As far as the distinction between Hindustani and classical, I think that is something that I should better not attempt here in this panel, and especially since there are musicologists here, like Professor Peter Manuel. But I think the distinction, especially in the textual tradition, first starts close to when Sharangadeva wrote the Sangeet Ratnakara in about the 13th century. And then there are obviously clear distinctions in the performative traditions that we see. And maybe Shiv, you'd like to talk about them a bit more because you're familiar with both Hindustani and classical.
I'm not, I shouldn't say that I'm familiar with Hindustani tradition, but there's an interesting kind of inflection of the popular classical question in Carnatic music, because often Hindustani ragams to the Carnatic trained ear sound, there's a distinct kind of aesthetic. It's actually very, they love Hindustani ragams. So, and there's a way of singing, and Carnatic, there's a way within Carnatic music of singing to kind of sound like the Hindustani style that people absolutely love. I mean, and there are artists who are good at doing this, like Gayatri from like Ranjini Gayatri, like she's like amazing at this. But just to give like an example of what that difference is, you had mentioned Charukeshi, which interestingly, like it does come from Carnatic music, but it can have a very Hindustani sound to it. And this is me doing the Carnatic version of Hindustani. So if you sang Charukeshi in a Carnatic style, you hear the gamaka. That's the kind of Hindustani. So you can even hear it in that style.
Great, thank you.
I'm so sorry to cut this conversation off, but we have much more performance in our future. So I'm told to direct you all across the hallway to Dance Studio 305, and I hope the questions that are brewing in your minds continue to percolate for the rest of the day, and thank you very much.